The race is on, and Haas has made a promising start to the new regulations, but now in its 11th season in F1, how is its Toyota deal helping the team to grow? And what realistically is its overall potential, given its unique setup and facilities? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to talk all things Haas is Scott Mitchell-Malm. Doing something a little bit different, because we spent some time with Haas in various locations, actually in the gap between Miami and whatever the race before that was. It was a long time ago, Japan, that extended gap. So good chance to take a deep dive into one of F1's perhaps less heralded, but in many ways most interesting teams.
Yes, Haas is. It feels very much like a proper fixture on the grid now. Been around for a decade, but still, I think elements of its challenge and how it goes about its business still quite misunderstood. I think that might also go for its eponymous team owner, Gene Haas, as well. We've often talked on this podcast about how Gene maybe has a slightly optimistic view of how his team should be performing versus what resources it has and what investment it's had, and into a really interesting phase at the moment with obviously the fledgling Toyota technical partnership and probably its best driver pairing that it's ever had. So certainly had a good start to 2026. So loads to talk about and loads to see when we went on our respective jaunts.
Absolutely. You visited the factory in Banbury, and a day later I went to the Silverstone TPC test with Gary Anderson. We've already done a tech podcast that we recorded in the garage there at Silverstone, so you can find that in the Race F1 tech show. But we're going to be talking about other things, a little bit more the broader team. And we've got an interview, in fact, coming up later on with Pierre Genon, who is the Toyota project manager, who'll tell us more about that deal, because the whole Toyota thing is pretty significant. But first off, Scott, let's look at Haas's setup, because they're sixth in the Constructors' Championship. Good start to the new regulations. Dependent on that technical partnership with Ferrari, so it gets as many of the latest spec transferable components as are permitted. Most of the car, except the aerodynamic parts, that means you've got the monocoque you've got to do as well, and a few other key areas. But a lot of the architecture and the bits and pieces that you need to make an F1 car run, but don't influence performance so much. Plus things like suspension, that's Ferrari. It's also got the Dallara deal. More recently, Toyota. It's got the Ferrari design base as well. How big, really, is the Haas Formula One team?
Well, you can look at it in two ways, because if you look at the core, I guess the full-time Haas personnel, it's a small F1 team. If you look at its design team, it's a very small F1 team. If you look at its production team directly employed by Haas F1, it's an almost non-existent F1 team with its outsourcing to various partners, you know, Dallara being a key one early on and still very much a significant player in the Haas ecosystem, but not quite as exclusive as it once was. Because Haas has these dependencies, its entire existence was hinged on the Ferrari deal, and then getting Dallara to do all of its production and the simulator work, for example, simulation work rather. That side of things has always been outsourced, basically. So it's kind of been a lean, mean racing machine in terms of what it runs out of the Banbury headquarters in the UK, and then you have personnel from Ferrari seconded to the Haas team working out the Maranello facility and so on and so forth. But all of that I'm kind of touching on there is an example of how actually the Haas F1 team is massive. It's a sprawling enterprise trying to make multiple sites work effectively. Two core Italian components in that Maranello design facility and what's going on at Dallara. Banbury headquarters is kind of like the beating heart of the team. That's what a few people that I spoke to on the day described it as. And now, obviously, what they're doing with Toyota. Now, that is ostensibly the Germany headquarters in Cologne, what was Toyota Gazoo Racing, but the rebrand that it had for this year has escaped my mind exactly what it's called now. It's basically Toyota's R&D arm, the motorsport arm based in Europe. They have the facility there, but that isn't doing, that's not actually doing any heavy lifting in terms of Haas construction or design work. What that's doing is providing personnel to run the testing of previous cars, program that Haas introduced in 2025. It's personnel on the ground. It's also now a new simulator, which is coming on later this year, which we'll talk about in a bit. But there's another sort of subset to that, which is the Epsom facility that Toyota Racing has, which Haas uses to, at the moment, calibrate the new simulator. So there's loads of moving parts here.
Yeah, and it all comes from how this team originated. It's worth just briefly reminding people of that, because at first this team was conceived as a Ferrari customer team, as in running Ferraris. Customer teams were outlawed. Gene Haas thought, right, this project's done. But Gunther Steiner, who of course had connected with Haas through his work in NASCAR, came up with this idea where you take as many of the non-listed parts, as they were then called, as possible. And so then they needed to graft on the aerodynamic capabilities from Dallara, etc. Originally, they had an entry for 2015. They deferred it to 16. And this allowed them to do what the 2010 new teams had failed to do, which is turn up and perform at a very credible, good level immediately. But it's such an interesting model, because I don't think you'll see any new teams coming in with this model. You would not be let in now. It was absolutely essential in the mid-2010s for a team to have any chance of getting up and running. F1 was a very different place now. But it's strange, isn't it? Because the team is bigger than its raw numbers because of that multi-facility thing and taking so much from Ferrari. And I feel like that gives it a shortcut to a certain level of performance, but also it blocks it off from a higher level of performance. And that's what the whole evolution of the team is about doing, isn't it? Because I think Haas has done a great job generally in F1 over the past 10, 11 seasons. I think they've only been last in the championship, is it once? Is that correct? Which is pretty impressive for the smallest team. So there is such a curate's egg of the team, because you can cast it as doing really well, or underachieving, or overachieving, depending on how you want to perceive these things.
Yes, and the way it was set up obviously has facilitated a degree of shortcutting versus if you were going to do absolutely everything yourself. I mean, some of the stuff that Cadillac's taken on, for example, in 2026 as F1's newest team, immediately outstrips what Haas is already kitted out to do. I think across the three sites, it's just under 400 strong Haas. Obviously, there'll be other supply chains and personnel chains sort of feeding into that, but I think that's the right number for Haas people specifically, which makes it between and when you've got the Banbury headquarters, for example, I think is 5.5 square meters, 5,500 square meters. It's not that small, which makes it basically between 3 and 9 times smaller than all the other F1 teams. So even now, it is still F1's smallest team, with Cadillac just having joined the grid. And if you took I say this quite a lot, so for those who are regular listeners to the podcast and all things Haas, I apologise for repeating myself, but it is the best way to frame the Haas challenge. If every single team achieved its theoretical maximum potential, Haas would be last. This is the team that should be last in Formula One, and it just more often than not isn't. In fact, quite often it's at the sharp end of the midfield, and sometimes that's brought scrutiny and controversy. Should an F1 team be allowed to exist this way? Does that diminish the achievement and so on? Like it's going to be down to individual interpretation. I think it's good that there are different ways to run F1 teams. I think part of that is what you said, Ed, that its ultimate potential is capped by its setup. If all the Ferrari teams do the best job, Haas should still be last of the Ferrari teams, because it does the least of its own. It has the least control over its final performance level. What it's doing within that, I think, is impressive for a second reason, which is it's not being particularly well set up for what kind of team it is. Like, it's so inefficient working across these different sites, and the work in the last few years, probably post-COVID, I would say there's been a huge emphasis on trying to do a lot more with what they have, because they weren't even really reaching the limit of what the Haas team was in that existence. And now it's about trying to raise the ceiling so that the bottlenecks aren't quite as choking as they've been for the last few years.
Yeah, and just to put some numbers on it, Cadillac, by comparison, no, actually, I'd argue this year Cadillac should be last. That this is an exception year for Haas in terms of, I think, performance potential for Haas this year is a little bit higher than Cadillac, but that's a very, very temporary thing. But Cadillac at the start of the year, they said they were almost 600 people. I imagine they've gone past 600 now. And in fact, Graham Loudon said the other day, the majority of their recruitment focus now is in the US, because obviously they're ramping up that facility just outside Indianapolis at Fishers that's being built. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. But Cadillac is making pretty much everything itself, isn't it? They take the gearbox internals from Ferrari at the moment, but the casing, the suspension carrier as it's called, they do themselves. So yeah, a very different model there. But not to put too fine a point on it, though, but if you go to Banbury, I didn't go this time, but I have been there in the past. It has to be the most unimpressive of the F1 facilities there is now. You can probably say what Racing Bulls had around its wind tunnel, which loads of people squeezed in that they've now no longer used. That was perhaps a rival to that, but it's really crammed in. It's not a sort of state-of-the-art, super shiny F1 facility, is it? It is really limiting, and in fact, that's why they're trying to do things to make better use of that space and expand it, and some of the things you were looking at when you paid a visit.
Yeah, it was really interesting to go up there and see it with my own eyes, because
had you not been there before?
No, I'd not been to Banbury, to the Haas facility, and actually on the morning, I had the bright idea of going very, very briefly. I basically ran around Banbury, checking out like the front of various race teams that are based there, because it's one of the great hubs within Motorsport Valley, not just for engineering. It's not just F1 team race teams. Sorry, it's engineering chains and supply chains and whatnot. But just from a race team perspective, it's really interesting, because there's Mahindra's Formula E team there. There's ProDrive, which obviously not a race team in the conventional sense, but a sarcastically large organisation, and dwarfs the Haas facility. It's just round the corner. But Arden's based there as well, the well-established, super successful junior single-seater team. And Haas is, I'm not going to pretend that it looks exactly the same. The Haas presence is obviously bigger in the part of the industrial estate or the retail part that it occupies. It is a bit more grand than Arden and Mahindra, obviously, because of the scale. But actually, when you clock the building from the outside, it basically just looks like a unit on a retail part with a Haas sign at the top. And then you go in through the gates, and there's, a more F1 standard kind of bespoke Haas facade to the building.
Huge competition for parking.
Yes, massive.
It's not the only F1 team that has that problem. Enstone's quite a tricky one for parking. That's another one.
Yeah. So there's there are cars. What's the polite way of putting it? Finding creative parking spaces within what's allowed. You can't just abandon your car in the middle of the road, obviously. But you can pretty much basically, if you find if it fits, they park basically. That's just a reality of it, and it looks like I know it doesn't house everything that the majority of F1 teams house, because of what we've been talking about what it does and doesn't do, and where its design facilities based, and all of that. But it doesn't look like it should be. It doesn't look like behind those walls there will be the majority of an F1 team, or especially the running of an F1 team. It actually looks a bit like a kind of, anyone who's been to a kind of, I don't know, touring car facility or a national race team, it looks like a glorified national racing team setup, basically, like a really big UK-based racing team or international racing team based in the UK, rather than an F1 team. And it's hard, because if you haven't been to these factories, and we've been lucky, we've probably been to pretty much all of them, if not all of them, between us now. The ones that like the big ones blow you away. The average ones are still really impressive, and then Haas is kind of on an island on its own. And really walking around it, it's kind of Pandora's boxy in a way, because you look at it from the outside and you just think that's a bit like that. How do you fit an F1 team in there? That's not super impressive. And then you go inside and you go, there's so much more in here than I thought there would be. There's like areas on top of areas, quite literally, with like a mezzanine structure that they've got going on there to create more space. And in that sense, it is really impressive, kind of what they've managed to crowbar into that space. And as I saw for myself, what they're still trying to expand, because they have the new simulator being installed.
Yeah, well, that's a big investment. I would say it's very, very clear Haas needs a new facility to replace that one. And I know there's been mutterings about it over the years, but they don't seem to have actually got very far with it for whatever reason. But yeah, they have done great things with what they've got there, but they are fundamentally limited. But yes, the driving loop simulator. Previously, they've used Ferraris. Obviously, that their deal gives them a very limited access to Ferrari simulator. But these are so important now. You really do need your own. And this, along with the TPC side of things, the testing of previous cars, the program that they launched last year, that's kind of the second key thing about the Toyota deal that they're currently working on.
Yeah, obviously, what I saw for myself was I saw obviously the whole internals of the factory. I saw the race bays. The cars were back. Quite rare, actually, at that, for them to all be in the race bays together, because often they're just being freighted around the world. But yeah, like where all the offices are. But then, interestingly, kind of the way that they're installing the simulator that Toyota's in the process of installing. So that's going to be it's the team's first on site, which is a big deal. But the work that's kind of gone on to even just like crowbar that into the building is really impressive. And one of the people who showed me around on the day is JP Loof. He's the head of UK operations for Haas. He basically runs the factory, make sure it all goes well. And rather than me butcher his own words, we've got a clip from him here where he's talking about the effort that went into basically fashioning the space to crowbar a Toyota simulator into.
So just to create this space, because it wasn't an empty space waiting to be used, we had to move. This used to be the business gym where every employee could come and train, the pit stop crew coming and training as well. So we had to take down the whole of the gym, the whole of the building, the room that was in it, and we put that into storage because we wanted to reuse it later. The TPC team that was operating in the other side of the building, we decamped them into storage for the winter. We set up the gym into where they used to be before clearing this space and building this new simulator in there. So I do apologize for the noise, but we are now nearly in completion of the room. Hopefully by the end of this week, beginning of the next, it will be all done. So we'll go in it in a minute and talk about the spaces. But in the space of 5 months, we created the room and the space, and the simulator is being installed now. You'll see the base of it. And then in front of it, just above you, or just above us, is actually the mess that used to home the gym that we reuse for cost saving and efficiency. So we stored it outside and put it back up. And this will become then the 2-car build bay for the testing. And they will call that their new home, hopefully in 3 weeks.
Yeah, I think that tells you a lot about the limitations they're working within and the kind of creativity that's needed to have what is an essential piece of equipment for a Formula One team today.
It's essential, but something that pretty much everybody in any other team, and probably a lot of people listening to this, would take for granted, because obviously F1 teams have simulators, but look at the effort that Haas is having to go to, the people at Haas are having to go to be able to have this, it's state of the art in terms of the tech involved, but, bog standard in an F1 context, having a simulator at your factory. And this will be primarily for car development work. Eventually, I think it will play a part in race weekend preparation and setup and that sort of thing. But it's a key development weapon now for kind of validating and checking what you're getting in the virtual development tools, wind tunnel, CFD, etc. So it's bringing Haas is basically bringing itself sort of kicking and screaming up to sort of minimum viable product, really, in a few areas. But when I saw the room for myself, and JP took us into the bit where the engineering bay will be, and he just pointed to the wall and just said, "And there's the only room in the whole building, and it's in the darkest room that the factory will have." Basically, because there was a small little, pretty small window on the side, and it was a light-hearted comment. But I thought the reason I mention it is because there is hardly any natural light inside, but they've got it's not just when you get into the bowels of the factory that it all goes a bit dark. You wander around into like main offices and stuff like that. There isn't a huge amount of it. So I agree with what you said before. I really think Gene Haas needs to recognize the asset that he's got and actually what these people are working with, because I walk around there and I think not just like, how are you running an F1 team from here, but how are you running an F1 team that's just regardless of the logistics and what they're responsible for, is punching so much above its weight in terms of the teams that it's managing to beat weekend to weekend, season to season. And everything we say about the factory is not meant to be said in a derogatory way about the team itself, and it's not meant to be snide remarks or anything like that. It's really just trying to contextualize the reality that Haas faces, because just calling it F1's smallest team doesn't do justice to the creativity with which it's having to work to achieve what it's achieved so far.
Yeah, it's a huge innovation and technical challenge in itself to make the most of all of this and deliver at the kind of level they're operating at consistently compared to some much, much, much better equipped, better resourced teams, even under the cost cap. And with the way F1's changed, that is a pretty remarkable achievement. And we're going to get a little bit more into the Toyota relationship, and in particular, the simulator project and some of the other things it's influencing in part 2. Well, we're now going to hear a full-length interview with Pierre Genon, who explains his role as Toyota project manager with Haas and the past, present and future of that TMG deal. I chatted to him at the recent Haas TPC test at Silverstone, and you'll even hear the bonus of Gary Anderson, our resident Team F1 technical director, who joins the fray later on in the interview with a few questions. And of course, a reminder, if you want to hear more from Gary, subscribe to the Race F1 Tech Show. But here's now me and Gary Anderson with Pierre Genon. Well, I'm joined now by Pierre Genon. Pierre, perhaps you could explain a little bit your job with Haas first.
Yeah, I'm the Toyota project manager at Haas F1, which means that I have to coordinate and drive all our various projects with Toyota, primarily technical. And we have 3 main projects, let's say, plus a few additional projects, but the main projects are the TPC program, obviously that's what we're doing here. The simulator, driving the loop simulator, and the composite parts production.
Okay. And it's a really interesting project, this, because obviously it's still relatively young.
Yes.
It's one of these deals, when it was announced, there was enormous possibility, but then then you've actually got to get to the point where it's put together and you start building on these things. So let's work through those individual areas. I mean, the TPC program seemed to be almost the first thing to get up and running. That's what's happening here today. So explain the reality of running that, because it's an older car, so it's its own little team unit, really, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, at a team level, the TPC is obviously under the framework of the FIA. We can do 20 days a year, so many miles of car that's normally 2 years old, etc. And ultimately, the philosophy of TPC is probably to train either drivers or personnel. Now, in our case, in our partnership with Toyota, the focus is the driver development program that I like to see as a joint program, not only a Toyota program, but it is obviously involving lower categories as well for Toyota. So we provide the Formula One layer, if you like, and the opportunity to test the drivers in the fastest cars in the world. And yes, it's the program we were able to reach maturity the first, because I like to think we know how to run a car. But having said that, for us, we still had to set up the operation independent from the race team. There was quite a lot of setting up, logistics, recruitment. That went on last year. That went quite well. And aside from the drivers already, we've had a few technicians that have been part of a team last year that made it to our race team this year. So that's already been a little success there. We're seeing also engineers, including from Toyota. It's very important for them to allow their staff to embed with the team and get the know-how back in their business. And in terms of drivers, of course, the holy grail is obviously to develop a driver all the way to a race seat. But it's F1, it's a meritocracy. It will happen if the circumstances are right, if all the boxes are ticked, let's say, and time will tell. Yeah.
And in terms of, you mentioned the production side of things, is that an area where Toyota is having to work on? Because obviously you've got historic parts supplies for these cars, but I presume those spares will not have lasted very long anyway. So I guess there has to be a manufacturing program for bits and pieces as they're needed for these cars.
I think typically the way the TPC framework exists with the regulations, 2-year-old cars, typically you normally can live on the stock of parts. Unless you go through too many, wings or something, you probably have to repair a few, but I wouldn't say you manufacture many new parts for a TPC program normally.
And the driver in loop simulator, that's a huge project. They're very complex pieces of kit. Obviously, you can get stuff off the shelf, but there's a lot of work that has to be done. You're putting it into a relatively modest facility, so I presume that created some challenges as well. So how have you gone about that process, building up? What's the timeline for commissioning and it being not just operational, but fully operational and
exactly,
at 100% contribution?
That's actually very key, because ultimately we are in a unique position until now in Formula One of not having our own facility. We have some access to Ferrari simulator, but we're talking far less days than we would normally like. Obviously, there's the distance. So it really is, for us, not only about acquiring the hardware and the software. This is the first part of the journey, and we'll be there sometime this year, and towards the middle of the year. But for me, that's almost the start rather than the end, because it's an operation that we just haven't got set up. We are building the team. My experience tells me that it will then take a few years to properly exploit it. Because a tool like that, it's a tool at the end of the day. What you get out of it is only as good as not just the hardware, but the quality of the operation, the sharpness of the people who use it, the procedures you develop over time. There's all sorts of things which we have to implement. There's a lot of people in the team who know what to do because they've been in that sort of environment before, but we still have to put it in place. So I would say, when we start to operate later this year, it's really the start, and it will be, I think it'll be a few months before we get some products in some areas, but probably a few years before we fully mature.
And obviously, Toyota have their own simulator programs. Historically, they had an F1 simulator program, but it's going back quite a long time for the sports car program. They're active. So how much of a rolling start does that give you, and how much are you having to build on that for the specificity of F1?
I mean, Toyota have access to the IP and the designs of that simulator. So obviously that's the head start, and a little bit of, I'm sure we'll get a lot of help in the setting up of a facility. Develop what's called the motion queuing, so how you use the platform to give the driver the information on what the virtual car is doing. There's definitely a head start there. Eventually, we'll have to learn to do our own things, I think, and both in terms of how we use the hardware, but generally operate the team around the simulator.
And talking about the production side, this is obviously massively important for the Haas F1 team, the clone facility. It's a long time since I've been there, but it was a great facility a long time ago. I imagine it's only evolved since then, but there's a lot of specialised, very precise work in Formula One. I mean, you go to any of the Formula One teams and the machinery they've got just to produce these to the minimal tolerances and all these kind of things is astounding. So can you give me an idea of the scope of that project and where it's got to? Because that's a very, very long lead time in terms of start to finish. I guess it really never finishes.
It's our longer term project, I would say. We are again in a very different position from most Formula One team, where we don't manufacture anything in house at this point in time. So this is kind of trying to break the mold a little bit. Pardon the pun. Yes, Toyota have got this production facility, but and we have a certain scope and an idea in mind of what parts we would like to produce together. But the key is, we don't want this to be a supplier-customer relationship, because that would be basically doing the same as we're doing now. What we'd like to achieve is a level of integration that's really very, very high, with the exception of the distance between us that we can't do much about. But everything else these days you can do quite closely together if you integrate the systems well. But we would like it to be as well integrated as if it was our own production department. That's the ultimate aspiration we have, because that's where you get the quality, the mass savings, the aero quality of the parts, the time to market to get the parts through the track, and the cost efficiency, because whether or not you are on the cost cap, ultimately you want to be cost effective, and that's key to be competitive. So there's a lot to achieve. We're going through some let's say trials now in terms of prototype parts together, not race car parts. And getting through the steps little by little. But I can't give you a time frame right now, but we have something in mind with a certain scope by a certain date in terms of delivering parts to the race car. So
I presume in terms of manufacturing prototype parts, you can look at them, analyse them, compare them to the real parts? Because obviously any kind of production, there's always that process of just trying to troubleshoot. And so is that how that process works?
There are real parts. They just won't make it to the race car just yet. But we test them physically like we would with a race car part. So it's going through all the process, first focusing on quality and integrating the systems, and then doing it quickly. That's quite important. And as I say, for the right cost as well.
And as I've said, this is a relatively young deal, so you're really early in this process. So in terms of your role, if I get my timeline right with you, you'll have come in specifically to do this, because it wasn't so long ago you joined the Haas team. So when you're presented with that project, it must be a fantastic opportunity, but there's also, it's such a broad brief, and there's so many directions you could go in. So how have you gone about trying to work out how to build this process in a constructive way, best efficiency, get the low-hanging fruit first? Because it's not quite building a Formula One team, but it's building a big part of the Formula One team.
It's a lot of aspects. I mean, these are we've talked about the three key elements, projects which almost pre-existed when the agreements were written. I wasn't even there, okay? And they remain probably the three key elements now, but really, yes, we could touch potentially any area of business. Nothing is really off limit. You know, there are regulations, technical, sporting, financial, etc. But within that frameworks, there's nothing stopping us from extending to other areas. So we do talk with Toyota on what else we could do. There's other projects we've done, smaller things that some have been successful already, some are work in progress, and probably a lot more we could do. You know, for Japanese manufacturers such as Toyota. The culture is very important. If they can absorb some, the positive aspects of the Formula One culture and bring them in their business, is very important to them. So how we can integrate people in an efficient way, that also helps us, but brings the know-how and the culture in-house for Toyota. That's also quite important. So we're looking at that. We had small wins on little projects that have been sometimes completed already. And 5 or 6 other projects ongoing at the minute. Probably smaller than the ones we've been talking about, but that ultimately it's a long-term deal, and we're taking a long-term view.
There's obviously a huge amount of potential in this, because obviously Haas has achieved great things in Formula One. Dallara has been and is a great partner, but what you're doing with Toyota it's effectively building up your own manufacturing production facility, even though it is with Toyota, with a partner, rather than kind of the Haas's. But this, I always think of teams in terms of performance potential, and I see this as a long-term discernible thing that raises the performance potential of the team dramatically over a long enough timeline. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. We know, I mean, the team is, for me, in my opinion, and I say that having only recently arrived, so I'm not taking too much pride in that personally, but the team has achieved some great things recently in terms of improving, and the last few years have been impressive. We obviously want to do better, but we also want to retain what's good about the team now, and that's something we need to take a little bit care of, because every time you do something differently, you think about what you might gain, you also need to think about what you might lose. So this is perhaps why we're not, I think we're pushing hard, but we're not necessarily rushing in every potential avenue of the partnership could open, because we need to make sure we do it right, we use our resources well, which has been, I think, a big positive of the team in the last few years. The potential is enormous. It's long term. We are talking about a lot of areas where we could do things together, but we're considering them carefully, all of them.
So it's a very strategic project, isn't it? Rather than one of these just go in and grab what you can. It's long term. And for it to work, it actually requires that kind of long horizon mindset.
Yeah, I think as a team, in isolation, let's say, as a team, we're thinking about how we should grow. Again, as I say, returning the qualities, but maybe breaking some aspects of the way we've been working so far. And systematically, we're looking at whether the partnership with Toyota can help us in these various new ventures, let's say. But it's certainly an exciting time to be part of a team with this partnership.
But you take, for example, when the ground effect rules first came in a few years ago, and the porpoising problems.
Yes.
I mean, nobody predicted that from all the simulation in the world, from all the wind tunnel testing.
That's pretty much correct, yeah.
In the wind tunnel, you can't run the car so it hits the belt.
Yeah.
So, the car runs on the track, it hits the ground. So, does the simulator help you with that?
I think as engineers, especially those involved in simulation, we always need to respect the fact we cannot model everything, and always never lose sight of what you're good at modeling and what you're not good at modeling, and never lose sight of that. Always be a bit humble. And these things are not perfect. They are tools. They're good at certain things, not good at other things. I know from my previous experience that in a simulator you could make the model bounce, porpoise, if you wanted to. That was typically thought of after the problem was found. But ultimately, unless you understood the mechanism, it was still a bit useless. You could make it porpoise, you could make it bounce and go, it does bounce, great. But
find a solution.
Does it make does it help me fix the problem? Not really. Is the porpoising getting worse when it should be getting worse on the real car, or better when it should be getting better? Not necessarily. It's just a trick to make it. Ultimately, it wasn't adding value to the work that was done on the simulator. So that's where I think you have to be a bit careful. Not ever lose sight. However impressive a tool is, it's still only a tool, and use it with intelligence and.
So, do you think that Formula One would be better if basically you were allowed more track testing and that had a consequence to simulator testing? In other words, should swap the two around. Would it be more effective for the performance, better budget-wise?
It's a good question, because if you could turn the clock back and go and do 100 days testing,
maybe not that.
Ultimately the teams. Now there's a cost cap. It's an interesting question, because ultimately all of that is easily controllable with a cost cap. Would it be better?
As far as getting the best performance out of the car.
Okay, if you had a choice, perhaps, let's say, I think you would probably move the cursor a little bit back more towards track testing, but I don't think you go all the way to 100 days and scrap your simulators. They are good at certain things. There are tests you can do much better than you can ever do a track test with wind, rubber that gets laid down, and million variables, and they are probably more cost effective, even if they are not cheap. So I think, again, coming back to understanding what they're good at and what they're not good at, you would do the things they're good at and then resort to the track for the things you can only do at the track. Where does that put? It's not a question we're having to face, because we don't have that choice at the minute. But if you put me on the spot, I would guess you would probably end up doing your, 30 days of testing or something like that rather than 3. But maybe not 150 with a dedicated test team.
Now, with all these races, more and more races every season as such, it would be nice. I think it would be nice to see if part of that penalty was the fact you had to do one test day, or you could do one test day per Grand Prix. So you'd have 24 Grand Prix, you'd have 24 test
that
days.
would probably be about the right amount, and using, if we collectively could agree, using the racetracks where you do races would be a logical thing to do. I think what's changed a little bit on the cars is, as we have more races, a cost cap, curfews as well, probably the individual parts have become very expensive, but we also have less of them. And back in the days of testing, the consumption of parts was atrocious, starting with engines, but also assemblies like gearboxes now, do many more miles than they used to. We would have to think again before increasing the test days too much. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Gary, and thank you very much, Pierre Genon.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Well, we had some fascinating stuff from Pierre Genon there on the Toyota deal. Scott, how far do you think this Toyota deal, which was signed, about 18 months ago it started, wasn't it? And they've got the title sponsorship effectively of the team. How far can it take Haas?
It's a very pertinent question. I think the main thing at the moment is that the ceiling has been raised for what Haas can achieve or what it can do in the short term and in the longer term. And then kind of how much really depends on other factors. So how invested does Toyota really want to get longer term? but also and to come back to what we were discussing in the first part, at what point is Gene either going to put his hand in his pocket again, or just relinquish part of the team, bring in external investment, whether that's Toyota or whether that's from somewhere else, a private equity group, whatever, because it's not going to have any shortage of offers, but there's no real indication he really wants to spend much of his own cash. And if that doesn't happen, you can't just raise one side of it. So what Toyota can bring is basically an evolution of what we've seen so far in terms of personnel, is maybe a basic way of saying it, because that's what's facilitated the TPC program. That's what's helping them with the installation of a simulator, as well as obviously that equipment. But there's a lot more that Toyota could do in terms of that European facility that it's got. Could it take on more production work, more design work longer term? Will it be a way of, in the same way that, Ferrari personnel end up working for Haas for a while? Toyota wants to use this to grow its people. And you see it with the drivers, how many different Toyota drivers have taken part in the testing program, but it's also engineers. So what kind of talent do they have within those ranks that could join and bolster the Haas workforce? So I would say kind of the scope of what it's capable of doing and the strength in depth of the people doing it are obvious areas in which Toyota can support Haas in the sort of medium term. Then longer term, what does it want to do? Does it want to make this kind of Toyota F1 through the back door? Does it want to be even more overt than that and just make it its works team? Does it want to build an engine eventually? I suspect that's not necessarily on the table, because Haas, I think, see the Ferrari deal as very much critical to the way it goes about things in the medium term, maybe even the long term as well. But yeah, I mean, right now, what Toyota's offering has raised the ceiling quite nicely. But what I'm not sure, and I don't know how you feel about this, I really don't know whether it's kind of Toyota's appetite or Gene's appetite that is going to be the next kind of bottleneck.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, ultimately, Toyota is using this to develop its own facilities and personnel, etc. at the moment. I don't doubt there will be those within Toyota who are trying to use this as a launch pad for something more officially Toyota, if you like. You could ask, could if F1 does the V8 engines for 2031, 2030, whatever year that happens to be, whatever form that is, will there be people within Toyota pushing for an engine program? That seems to be possible. Could Toyota decide they want a works team again? Because obviously it was 2009, the last time the factory team was an F1. Again, there will be people within Toyota that want to do that. And Haas could be the team they do it through, or it could be a team that working with, they sharpen their facilities so they can do it themselves, or with someone else. I think the really important thing is there's nothing set in stone. This isn't some well-strategized, phased-in program. It is genuinely this is an opportunity for a mutually beneficial partnership. That's what they're working through at the moment. And that might be it. And if that's it, that's plenty, because that's doing a huge amount for Haas, which can do more and more stuff with TWG, and that will help it be a better team. So I feel like this is one of those relationships that could go in all sorts of different directions, but really it is about the here and now and the next few years, because they've really only scratched the surface over what is possible in terms of enhancing Haas. They could have this relationship for 10, 15 more years and still be getting more and more and more out of it, and it doesn't need to be anything else.
Yeah, and that's kind of exactly how it was envisaged when it was set up as that technical partnership in October 2024. The whole point, and Komatsu, the Haas team principal, talked about this at the time, was that they would basically see how it goes. Like, where are going to be the areas that both can benefit? How can it be escalated? So, the test program and the commitment to doing a simulator came around quite quickly. But then for 2026, and you mentioned it earlier, they expanded into the title partnership role as well. And that is something that's given it a lot more prominence. But an example of how not, I don't want to say ill thought through, but to your point, that it isn't this, super well strategized, it's going to be over this many years and each year we're going to do this. Toyota rebranded that Toyota Gazoo Racing element, and the way it sort of splits its works programs and its supported programs, literally as Haas was announcing itself as like TGR Haas F1 team for the year. So Haas carries the initials of something that doesn't actually exist within the Toyota structure. as of the start of this year. And that's an example of how, like, the kind of ad hoc nature of expanding this can potentially play against it. I would say that the main thing that I think I'd like them to avoid is, while the idea of, utilizing that Cologne facility is all well and good, I don't think that should happen unless it comes when pulling back something else. I think it would be a mistake if there was too much of a dependency on yet another location in the mix. It's taken Haas a very long time. Komatsu's done a very good job on this side with his technical leadership team in terms of making the most of that kind of Banbury-Maranello alliance. That, the dependency on Dallara has been reduced slightly with other contractors, I think, but I don't think you'd want to have Banbury plus Maranello plus Dallara doing a bit plus Cologne doing a bit. That's all getting a little bit too disparate for an organisation that's already fairly stretched. Again, I think it comes back to, what could Toyota support if Haas if Haas was able to go a little bit clean slate. Look, they're not going to make a campus like Aston Martin's done at Silverstone. I think that would be silly to expect that. But is there another site within the UK that would allow for something new, or them to move into somewhere that already exists that could be repurposed or retrofitted for F1 needs? Because that wouldn't be the ideal way to start totally from scratch. But I still think that's better than persevering with what Haas have done now. I think you would have immediately a better base, and maybe Toyota could facilitate that, because you could stock that with personnel, they could help with funding, they could help with the technology, and so on and so forth. And you'd go from this situation where, to come back to what JP was talking about before with the way that they've moved stuff around, like it's basically like almost playing this organizational game where, to fit something else in, stuff's being stacked on top of other things, moved around so that something doesn't just pop out the other side of the factory. And a good example of that was when a load of stuff was going on over the winter, and they were just approaching the first test at Barcelona. The race support team basically did a bunch of work around that test from a meeting room in Banbury, because the actual place where they would normally be sited in that moment, it was too noisy, because it's basically a work site, a construction site going on down there. So sometimes needs must, right? Like, there's only so much space. It is finite, but it's finite. But there has to be a better future for Haas to operate out of, because there's no doubt that they are pushing close to the maximum now. Komatsu always said it was about getting the most out of what they had before they could start removing the next bottlenecks. But they have to be, if they're not already, pushing at that limit now.
Yeah, it's such a curious team in that regard. It's difficult to imagine it continuing indefinitely for the next 10, 20, 30 years in this sort of form, constantly dependent on other entities beyond needing an external engine supplier. Let's put it that way, which is a bit more in the normal scheme of things. So it's one of those teams that I think there's lots and lots and lots of potential directions for it. They could sell to a completely different entity. And again, Gene Haas has shown no inclination to sell. There have been potential buyers who have got in touch with them, and it's very possible that maybe at least one of those buyers may even have actually had the resources to potentially do something serious, because there are a lot of chances around sniffing about F1 teams. But that's also a possibility. But I almost feel like if you were buying a Formula One team, to an extent with Haas, you're buying the slot, aren't you? And then you're kind of doing a bit like BAR did with Tyrrell. You're effectively doing a startup team using that entry. I mean, there's lots of good people there and good things. It would be less disconnected than that was, but it would be in that sort of thing, because if you look at what you're actually getting there with Haas, the slot is the most valuable. And then you're thinking, well, we've got this, but that's a contract with Ferrari that delivers that. That's a contract with Toyota that delivers that. A contract with Dallara that delivers that. That's a lot of external entities that you're kind of committing to continued deals being able to happen with, to be a going concern. Whereas if you buy a lot of other Formula One teams, you are getting a Formula One team that can, perhaps with the exception of the engine, pretty much do everything. So it makes for a really, really interesting future. And I think the fascinating thing is it's not set in stone, isn't it? There are so many different directions it could go in. And I kind of like what Io Komatsu has done in terms of the direction he's tried to take it. It's kind of practical, small steps that over time push up that performance potential. without getting too caught up in trying to do grandiose, massive, big things that isn't really his kind of job, is it? That kind of falls into the world of Gene Haas. If he wants to sell, or if Toyota suddenly says, hey, let's buy this team and make it Toyota F1, possible, but again, not something that's very much agreed or going to happen. It's not a secret glide path to that. So I don't really know. I think sometime in the future we're going to sit down for a podcast and something big will have happened redefining Haas's future, but it could be any number of different things.
I do think as well there's been points in recent years. I don't think it's necessarily this way now, but there definitely was a point around COVID where I think one option was that the team would just stop, because it's not
without the cost cap and the cost cap being lowered and the changes they made to the Concord Agreement, I think it would have done.
Yeah, and basically Günther Steiner, who was team boss at the time, was basically told if you can find the money to keep it running, you can keep running the team, basically. Because Haas isn't someone who would need to sell the team and recoup his money or anything like that. He's got more than enough money for several lifetimes. So the team could just cease to function because Gene's not bothered with it anymore. I mean,
but with the value of teams, though, it would be illogical not to sell it, though. You would sell it, but you're right. Exactly what that would follow is another question.
But he could have done that in 2020, but he wasn't going to. It was basically close the team or you find a way to keep it running. Like he wasn't entertaining selling it. He was just going to stop it. And surely now, because the values are so much higher, that must be different. But I would also like to think that with the value being so high, with the way the team's improved, with the Toyota partnership, with what they're trying to do, and I know there are people at that team that are trying to make it clear to him sort of where the limitations are. Surely the motivation would be there to be like, do you know what? With a bit of this here, with a bit of that there, this team could achieve so much more. But again, go right back to what I said near the beginning about misplaced expectations. I do think one of the biggest roadblocks here will be kind of this potential assumption within the overall total ownership of the team and the people around him that what it has already is enough to be achieving X, and it might not be achieving X at the moment. Like last year, for example, there was an opportunity to do better in terms of the performance of the car. And that was kind of misconstrued a little bit by Gene and others as, well, Haas, we failed to hit our target for this year. And it's like, well, yeah, but that will be the case if you set a target that the team shouldn't hit in the first place. So it's really interesting to kind of ponder where it goes and where the ultimate limitations will be, what form it needs to take. And ultimately, if it does have to relocate, if there has to be a new factory, if all the stuff that it's doing there just needs to be kind of picked up, moved somewhere else and expanded by, double basically, just to be par for the course, what happens there in terms of how easy is that transition? Who oversees it? How many new people are they joined by? What does the workforce increase by? What are the demands that get taken on? What does it start to do itself? And obviously that would go hand in hand with whatever Toyota wanted to do, if there was anything it wanted to do on the technical side. So the main thing, I suppose, the best way to summarize is it's got an absolutely fascinating future, just because the possibilities seem fairly endless, but a lot of them are quite exciting. Whereas just a few years ago, I don't think if you worked at Haas, you would be optimistic about the future at all, because you genuinely wouldn't know if the team had one.
Oh, absolutely. And it's been a tremendous turnaround, and they're delivering great things on track as well relative to what's possible. And I like the approach they're taking with drivers, with Ollie Behrman in particular, really backing that ability there, and they're getting some great results out of that. So it's made it a lively and interesting team. I guess what I'd really like to see, wouldn't it be great if just Gene Haas decided to go all in on it, and because he's the sole owner of it, he can control the strategy. You could have a genuine, proper, long-term, long-horizon strategy for building up the team. And okay, you might well have to sell a minority stake to free up some cash to invest in doing that. But wouldn't that be fantastic? Because then you get a kind of old-school private owner still maintaining control, but actually thinking, right, let's take this team from being this overachieving curiosity into being potentially, in the long term, a big beast in Formula One.
Well, just to maybe give people a little bit of homework off the back of this podcast in terms of something to go out and look for, but maybe you, Ed,
that's always what listeners want. They always want homework after the podcast.
Exactly, but also for you, if it's something that you will have seen many years ago but forgotten, it's worth everybody, including us, having a look at the Canapolis facility that Haas has for the F1 team, not just for Haas as a company, objectively for the F1 team. It makes a mockery of what they have at Banbury. I've seen photos of it. I've seen footage from it. It is so kitted out beyond what Banbury has. And it's ludicrous because I think the idea was that would eventually be the F1 team base. Back when, obviously, would have been in sort of its... When was the Canapolis facility done? That would have been probably for the start of the entry, right? So in 2014-15, this would have been worked on. It has so much. It's so much more like F1 standard in terms of the aesthetics, but obviously it's based in North Carolina. So it's actually, there's a really, really tiny percentage of the F1 team work is basically done from there. But it's such a what could have been for Haas. Like if they could just transport that brick by brick to somewhere in the UK, or like even if you could utilize that, I bet there's so many people at Haas that would just take that as their day-to-day facility. Like, you don't need to buy us a brand new one, please. Can you just find a way to bring this one over? Honestly, if you don't know what I'm talking about, if you haven't seen it, try and just Google Canapolis Haas F1 and have a look at the photos, and then Google Haas F1 Banbury, and you'll see the difference just from the outside.
Simple, and just tow it across the Atlantic. That's how these things work, isn't it? That's the dream. But yeah, it tells you. Once again, this is a team that historically there are all sorts of different routes it could have taken, and we're again at that same point. So, yeah, who knows what they'll be. For now, they are basically pitching in a great season to be leading the midfield, and in a sort of solid season, they'll be in the middle of the midfield, and then a season where others are achieving the performance they should do, and maybe they're underachieving or close to their potential, that they'll be at the back. So, yeah, Haas has, we've talked about the future in such uncertain terms. There are so many potential futures for it. And I just really hope it's a positive one, because there's a lot of good people there. They've done some great things. And I think we've seen enough of a spark from there, particularly with actually this kind of second phase of the team, the new impetus, Günther Steiner moving on. We're a bit dubious about that happening at the time. Maybe in retrospect, it did need that sort of change. He'd taken it to a certain level and done remarkably well, but it did need the Io Komatsu era to make a lot of these things happen. I doubt some of the things that we've seen recently would have necessarily happened. It would have been different. Something better may have happened. Who knows? You just don't know. But yeah, I'm just really interested to see what direction it goes. And I hope that from listening to this, people have got an idea about what Haas is achieving, because it would be very, very easy, I imagine, for fans on the outside just for Haas to be kind of there and think, oh yeah, Haas their midfield, that's a bit boring, or fall into the trap of like Sauber always used to get criticism back in the day for not being ambitious enough. And maybe you could argue there's a bit of that with the ownership, but actually in terms of the team itself, I see tremendous ambition in what they're trying to do now, despite all of these constraints. So that's why I'm delighted that we were able to spend a little bit of time with Haas and hopefully give everyone listening a bit more of an understanding of this unique Formula One team. So thanks very much, Scott. Now, a reminder to everybody, in fact, you may have heard Scott talking about that run he took when he visited Banbury. He turned that into a video for the Race Members Club, where you saw him sped up, running around, looking at all the signs and the outside buildings for ProDrive and Mahindra and Haas, etc. That's the kind of thing you get with the Race Members Club. It's not all Scott running. There's bonus podcasts, all sorts of different videos. There's a thriving community. Hit the link in the episode description or head to Patreon and search for the Race or the Race Members Club to find out more about that. Right, we're going to be back very, very soon, likely with some chat about Max Verstappen's outing in the Nürburgring 24 hours. But until then, stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.